Hi, it's Erin again. I just wanted to add another installation to my BookTube channel. This week I kind of want to talk to you about magical realism because, for one, I'm doing a project in a class that is kind of centered around this, and I just wanted to share with you some ideas and things that I've learned about magical realism throughout the course of the semester because I feel that it's a branch of literary, like you could call it a genre or a style or it's kind of like a fluid, almost a movement of literary writing, and so I feel like it's something that is definitely underrepresented in academia and in typical like everyday book conversation. So I kind of wanted to cover the bases a little bit and just share with you what I've learned. Just because I feel that, as I've said before here on my BookTube channel, I feel like you can only go so far with being an academic in terms of making a difference or getting literary ideas out there into the world if you're only speaking to academic audiences. And so I just wanted to kind of share with you, as a graduate student, kind of speaking to general book lovers, what I've learned. So you might be confused what magical realism is. It's actually, when I started the class, I figured it had something to do with any sort of book that sort of incorporates magical elements. But what I learned was really interesting and actually bears a lot more on the realist side of that magical realism title. So just to give you a little bit of background, this style kind of came out of Germany in the early 20th century. This art style of new objectivity. It was almost bordering into surrealist. Where you would have something kind of regular and realist, but then there'd be just this magical element popping in, and nobody that was within the artwork would really question why that existed. And that's kind of what translated over into literature. We had mainly, you'll see this coming from Latin American writers. It's a very big tradition there. You've probably heard of 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So this kind of style gained a lot of currency in places like that, just as the century wore on and as people were sort of writing retroactively about the different upheavals and political realities and things that were going on in those parts of the world. So you see that coming to play, sneaking into, like if you're like me and an English language reader, you see that coming into translation via the Latin American writers and arriving on the scene, bringing that magical realist element here. So what magical realism is and how this was different from anything that could be perceived as maybe fantasy or maybe on the science fiction side of that kind of unrealistic thing coming in. It's basically you're telling a story, everything's normal, but there's this just magical element that can't really be explained by normal logic. And that pops into the text, and the characters don't really question it. They almost just accept that it's there. And this differs from typical fantasy in that in a fantasy text, like say Harry Potter, for example, you have Harry going into this universe where everyone knows that there's this separate space that's magical. You have world building that's a little bit different than what you would see in magical realism with fantasy. So, in a fantasy text, you would typically see a whole world created that would incorporate these magical elements and then some realism mixed in. And it's just assumed by the reader that this is just a magical place where even though everyone in the story might be considering these things as commonplace, it's still a little bit different from magical realism in that magical realism is mostly realism with a little bit of magic element that isn't questioned, that goes on to sort of what we call in academia like a defamiliarizing catalyst that'll take the story from what you think it might be on the surface, but is actually making a much larger political or social statement on underneath once you consider what the magical realism is doing. And so one thing that I found really interesting this semester as we were going was that the texts that we've read that incorporate magical realism are actually saying quite a bit more than they seem to on the surface. And they're actually saying a little bit more than maybe some of the overt messages that you see going on in like maybe fantasy texts that I've read. It's more, the magic in those cases is more in the business of creating an ongoing large sort of book-length metaphor. And so, what I find really interesting about these texts, like, say, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you have this place called Macondo that overall seems pretty basic and pretty realist, pretty down to earth. But then you have these magical elements taking place. You have blood flowing all through town after someone dies, and it's turning corners and gaining speed going uphill, and things that are defying physics and things that defy what we would consider as a realist text. But what those elements are doing is it's actually revealing this deeper level of meaning and adding some more interest to the text that goes beyond what realism can do. And when you talk to magical realist authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you'll find that many of them, including, I've got one right here, Cristina Garcia, Dreaming in Cuban, she came and spoke to our class and actually said the same thing as Marquez, which was that it wasn't necessarily their intention to be a magical realist writer. Their intention was really just conveying stories the way that they had been told stories throughout the generations. And what was unique about these two writers is that they both come from like sort of the central Latin America place. And so when we see that, and when I say we, I mean people, I guess, coming from my own standpoint, are, say, Westerners, Americans. I grew up in the Midwest in a very small town, so I exclusively grew up speaking English, and that had all of its like nuances with storytelling into it too. But it was really interesting to me as a writer coming from that standpoint to approach magical realist texts, because what I'm getting with this magical element woven into the realism is essentially a glimpse at the way other cultures weave their stories and the rhetoric they use and the devices they use to get their points across. So for someone who was kind of told stories pretty straightforward growing up, and someone who was told, oh, there's no such thing as magic, there's nothing wondrous in this world except Santa Claus, and oh yeah, by the way, that's fake. It was interesting to me to see a text where you're making a point, but you're making a point in kind of a sneaky way. And so what I think is really interesting about that, particularly when you compare culturally the difference between, say, Anglo-American authors who speak in English, storytell in English, and use the sort of rhythms and devices that we use typically to tell stories in the United States and, for example, the UK. When you compare those two, it sort of reveals a lot about what we're saying and the coded messages we're delivering in our storytelling. So one of the examples that I use that I think is really helpful to understand why magical realism is so important is, say, okay, so take Mary Wollstonecraft. She is a prominent feminist writer, and she did a lot of work toward the very beginning of the 19th century, tail end of the 18th century. She wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which many people are familiar with, is a typical liberal feminist first wave sort of tract about how women should be equal, they should have equal education, opportunities, work, all that kind of thing. Pretty tame by today's standards. But she also wrote a novel, which it was called Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman. And her novel was not well received for a couple reasons. Number one, she died before she could finish writing it, so that's always going to be a little bit of a buzzkill when it comes to, editing your message and making it commercially successful. But the other thing about it was that once it was released after her death, she was kind of attacked because the reading public perceived her work as more of a polemic, and they were coming into it expecting a novel. So they were expecting something that maybe had a little bit more nuance, a little bit more wonder to it, and less of a direct, hey, this is what's happening and it sucks and you guys need to pay attention. Because what happens in that book is there's a woman who ends up, she was married, now she's not. She ends up kind of wandering around. She can't find any gainful work. She's basically relegated to this impoverished state and then ultimately ends up committing suicide. And the whole point of Wollstonecraft having written that book was to show the social iniquities that happened to women, as particularly unmarried women, in Britain at the time. But it was not well received. On the other hand, And I feel like this is where a style like magical realism comes into play, especially when you're telling a political story like this, is that it distracts the reader, it gives them a little bit of wonder, it gives them that little push for saying, hey, this is a text that's about something very deep. And yes, it's going to have a political message, but you're also going to have to maybe think about it a little bit, or maybe perhaps see it from a different point of view. So when we talk about incorporating magical realism into this world, it's really interesting because it's making these political stories more palatable. It's making social justice more palatable. And so when you're reading these texts, even though many authors didn't write them with the intention of having that kind of thing happen, it's still really interesting, particularly to those of us who are writers. It's an interesting tool to have in our toolbox, right? So we can tell these stories without coming off too polemic. And of course, that isn't to say that you shouldn't be telling messages in your stories and you should have to sneak things under the radar. No, absolutely not. But what I am saying is that it's important for writers and scholars, general readers, everybody who's everyone who's interested in making sort of an activist message, making their world better. It's interesting to understand the value of something like just changing up your style and your rhetoric a little bit in your storytelling, because that can ultimately have a much greater bearing on the way that your work is received, the amount of difference you're able to make. It helps a lot, and it makes a really big difference, especially for the reader, which of course ultimately that's who you're writing for. So I just wanted to share those couple of elements with you, and I am going to be posting a little bit more about magical realism, but I just kind of wanted to give you a brief introduction. So be sure to comment, let me know how things are going. I'm also going to link to my blog, so please visit me there if you have not yet already. Thank you. Have a great one.